What's the scariest real story you have? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. When I was in college, during finals week, my two best friends and I would meet up after a long night in the library to smoke pot and go our separate ways for the night. They lived on campus while I lived off. I would pick them up in my car when I got done studying, and we'd park down in a large commuter parking lot overlooking a large river and woods. It was about midnight, and we were doing the usual, smoking and listening to music, when we noticed a local police officer driving around with a spotlight in this nearly empty parking lot. Paranoia set in, so we put out the bowl and waited in silence for him to leave. Eventually he left and we continued on. All of a sudden, this woman came out of nowhere totally ragged and stopped in front of my car, staring into the windshield at us. Shivers went down my spine as I couldn't get over why she would have been doing that. She eventually walked away into the woods. At that point, I was ready to leave. But one of the three of us who didn't see her directly was convinced that we were high and paranoid, so we continued to sit there. I was shaking and just felt entirely uneasy and unsafe, so I kept looking over my left shoulder behind my car. My friends were joking about how weird that was as I just engrossed in my paranoia. I had a feeling we weren't safe. A few minutes later, I had begun to look over my shoulder less and less, but happened to look behind my car to see the same woman sprinting toward the driver's door with a knife in her hand. My sympathetic nervous system kicked in, and I started the car without saying a word and booked it out of the parking lot, not stopping until I was off campus entirely. She had creeped around all the cars in the parking lot, going all the way around the perimeter to attack my car from the back. Later, we found that the police were looking for her. She had previously killed her husband and the woman he was cheating with. The police were sure she was going to try to steal my car with violent force. Hands down, the scariest thing that has happened to me. My friends would agree. One of my old friends went missing. Another friend and her friend came to visit my house one day a week or so after. One of them was acting weird, saying stuff like, "Remember how we hung out last week?" and just asking to hang out. She became a suspect, and turns out she murdered the other girl out of crazy jealousy conspiracy with her ex. She was trying to get me involved as an alibi or some shit. I'm 17, at home watching my baby sister who is 11. She's downstairs watching TV or whatever, and I was upstairs playing video games getting ready for bed. My sister is pretty awesome, and I could always trust her to go to bed at a relatively decent time. To my surprise, my mom peeked her head in my darkened room and I cheerfully waved goodnight. I couldn't see her face, just a head poke itself into my room, look at me and back away. About a half an hour later, I go downstairs for some water and I'm surprised again. This time by my sister, who is still watching the last of her TV show. I didn't care if she was still up, but my mother would have promptly put her to bed, as she was much stricter. She asked me if I knew where mom and dad would be home, and I just immediately took her hand and took her out of the car, and we sat there until I called my parents, who came home immediately. No doors and windows were unlocked beside the side door I unlocked to bring my sister outside. I still wonder who or what the F poked its head in my room. When I was about 10 or 11, my brother, friend, and I were playing outside in the backyard. We end up going over by a big pine tree, and my friend finds a butcher knife on the ground underneath it, along with a bottle of ketchup and a dead gopher laying next to it. We told my mom, who called the cops, who suspected that it was a local criminal whose dad lived in our neighborhood and had been suspected to be hanging around the area. A couple nights later, I'm fast asleep in my bed. Around 2 a.m. or so, my mom comes flying into my room and starts yelling out the window, "Get out of here!" Turns out the criminal was hiding in the tree and my mom saw him walking around our yard. He fled from our yard after my mom yelled out the window, and a cop was driving around our road with the spotlight on searching for the guy. Never found out what happened after that, but 12 years later or so, I still remember how scared I was. One of my closest friends from college reported to the police that someone was trying to break into her house. The next day she went missing. Police wrote it off, saying she was mentally ill and did little to help, but she had no history of mental illness. The search continued for a couple of months until they found her body in a creek miles away from her apartment. She had no shoes, car, or wallet. The creek runs from her apartment to where she was found, but it was ruled virtually impossible for her to get there solely by floating downstream. Her case went cold. It haunts me not knowing what happened to her, but thankful she was able to be put to rest. My mom told me about this story. One time when I was an infant, she took me grocery shopping and had me sitting in the little baby seat in the cart. Apparently, After she looked through a few spots in the frozen food section, she turned around only to see a woman walking away, pushing the cart that had little old me sitting in it. Really scary to think how easily people can be taken and how easily people can take. Sometimes I wonder if my mom is really my mom or that lady. My sister and I were very young, and our great uncle, a priest, loved to tell us ghost stories before bedtime. This isn't your average campfire story either. This is the kind where it's read from a book and takes a while. Well, my family stayed with my great uncle every Thanksgiving, and my sister and I had to share a room with 2 twin beds. We moved to the same bed, and my great uncle sat on the other reading us a new ghost story. Well, this particular time, he read a tale of a man who lost his hand and was given the amputated hand of a murderer to replace it. My great uncle was a storyteller, probably the best I've ever known, and many times during the story, he would do voices and mimic parts with his hand in an attempt to try and scare us more. In the end, he would close the book and tell us to go to bed. This time, he asked that we pray against the bed, and we were both in, and as my sister and I knelt to pray, my mother reached out from under the bed and grabbed both of us. I had no idea she had been there the entire time. To this day, it is one of the most terrifying moments of my life, and they both retell the story at Thanksgiving every year. This happened to a friend of mine, and she was so nonchalant after it happened. It was a summer night, had to be around 8 or 9 at night. It wasn't too late, and the sun was still setting. She was driving home and stopped at a traffic light that intersected with the highway. We live in a smallish town, so there were hardly any other cars out, and she was literally the only one at the light. Her car stopped at the lane closer to the left turn lane, one of those 5-lane streets. So she's minding her own business, zoning out or what have you, and all of a sudden, she hears the passenger door trying to be opened. She looks over, and there's a coked-up homeless guy that had opened the door. So she grabs a drink from her cup holder and chucks it at him. It was enough of a surprise to back him up, and she quickly reached over to shut the door and lock it. He drunkenly reached for the door again, and as she looked at his face, she knew he was out of it. By the time the light had already turned green, and while she persisted, she peeled right on out of there. Not a crazy story, but crisis averted. I was walking down the street with a friend during college. A woman was driving down the street, and a girl passed us. She was about 7 or 8. She was walking a dog and passed by some bushes that extended out to the street. This was by an old park that wasn't maintained well. The woman that was driving didn't see the girl and hit her and the dog. They went in 2 different directions. The way they landed, it was obvious they were dead. One of them made a sickening crunch sound on impact, but I don't know if it was the girl or the dog. Then the woman gets out and starts screaming and crying. She's yelling at me that she can't go to jail and she didn't see them. I'm trying to tell her that she won't get arrested because it was an accident, and my friend is calling for help on her phone. This woman tells me to move away from her, so I do because she's hysterical. She runs into her car, removes her purse, takes out a fucking gun. She shoots herself and lands on the hood of the car. I was in shock. I just witnessed 2 people and an animal die. I was already devoid of reaction after that. Later, I was told by a therapist that she might have been on drugs, which explains her reaction. I wonder why we all had to be involved in this situation. I think about that little girl and the dog all the time. She would have been around 21 now. Pretty tame compared to some other stuff here. I was in a car wreck when I was 15. I wasn't wearing my seatbelt. We hit a ditch and my head flew into the window next to me. I woke up in a car 30 minutes later on the way to the hospital. I remember holding a cup filled halfway with my blood and running my tongue around in my mouth. I remember finding a gap in my mouth and thought I'd lost a tooth. Turns out I didn't lose a tooth. I split my jaw apart by 1/4 of an inch and shattered the other side of my jaw. I was cut all along my neck and shoulder with glass. The cuts on my shoulder were 1.5 inches deep, and they traveled up to my neck where they got more shallow. I could have died that day if I was a little unluckier. So please, wear your seatbelts. If not for your own life, don't make your family and friends live with the pain of losing someone close because it's uncomfortable. In 2006, I went to Germany with some friends. I'm from Italy. We had planned to camp in the Black Forest with a group from Germany, a group from Switzerland, and a group from Hungary. Pretty cool, right? Well, one night, me and some other friends really had to pee, but we were terrified to leave our tent because, Black Forest, freaking pitch black. So we took courage, left our tent, and went all together to pee. While we were doing the act, me and a friend of mine hear a woman screaming in the distance. We start to freak out. We don't know what to do. What if it's like a big animal coming for us? Then an older guy that was with us, I was 13, tried to calm us down and said that it was probably an animal running away from another one. It happens in a forest so big. So we went back to our tent all cool. Camp was freaking awesome. Went back to Italy all happy. I'd almost forgot about that night. Well, after a few weeks, I'm home reading some stuff online, and just for curiosity, I go and see if during the summer of 2006, something happened in the spot where we were camping. Found out that in the same period, August 2006, a few kilometers away from where we were, a woman was found dead. I live in a city that is kind of dangerous because of the whole narco-traffic thing. So, one time I'm going home after college around 10 p.m. and on my way home I notice something almost in the middle of the street, and I think it's a big black trash bag. But as I get closer, I start to see the shape of a leg, then an arm, and when I'm at 2 feet, I can see it clearly. This body of a dude that was beat up to death. I can see his whole eye out of his face, part of the skull, his face covered in blood. In his chest, I can clearly see wounds from multiple stabbings and more shit. And before someone could see me there, I just run home. Next day, I saw the dude in the newspaper. Being honest, that thing still haunts me. On Grindr, dude keeps messaging me, doesn't have a face pic, gets very aggressive when I don't respond. Last message is, "I know you." Turns out to have been an older, closeted coworker. I found out because he effing cornered me and threatened to out me if I didn't F him. Told him I didn't give an F who knew. He got mad and told me, watch my back. Went straight to my boss and he was fired. Never heard from him again, but some nights when I'm out delivering, I swear I see his car following me. My dad was in the logwoods at 5:30 a.m. He saw a guy on the side of his logging trail leaned up against a tree with a bottle of rye whiskey in between his legs. An old black man in overalls is how I remember him telling the story. The guy just looked asleep, but my dad checked on him as this was pretty deep into the woods. He started by saying, "Hey, mister," which had no effect. He then leaned down and began shaking his shoulder. That didn't work either. He then went to slap his face, and as soon as his hand touched the man's face, my dad said all the blood ran out of his face and he thought he might pass out. The man's face was as cold as ice, and it had a waxy quality to it. He was very much dead, and my father was all alone with him miles deep in fog-covered woods. Fun epilogue, my dad had the worst time getting the cops out there. It was the 70s, so he couldn't just make a cell call. He was deep in the woods, in a black-populated area in the south. He was alone and was white. He knocked on house after house, but no one wanted to hear from a random white guy with a truck full of chainsaws at 6 a.m. I like to think a lot of them looked out the window and just said, "Not effing today, nope." Finally, a very skeptical family opened the door, and he was just asking to use the phone to call the police. The mom handed the phone to him from the door and asked him what number he wanted to dial. He said 911, I guess. Cops interviewed him for a while and determined the guy just wandered off drunk in the woods and died of exposure. No foul play, as there were no marks on him, and he was just leaned up against the tree with a bottle of rye. I suppose it's not blood-chilling, but it's the scariest thing I know of that didn't turn out to be nothing. It really was an effing dead guy. True story. This is the only paranormalish thing I have ever experienced. This happened back when I was 18 years old. I was working at a bakery, and my coworker friend asked me if I wanted to smoke some weed with him at his place after the shift. I agreed, and we met up to smoke at his apartment. As we smoked, we started talking about mushroom trips, and he described a really bad trip he once had, calling it pure emotional torture. He couldn't articulate exactly what it was that made it so bad, just a horrible spiraling down, losing his mind and feeling totally insane. It was really disturbing, and I could tell it still had a lingering impact on him. Eventually, he had his head in his hands, and he told me, "I really wish I could just forget it all." There was the kind of awkward pause, I guess, because he felt he'd exposed himself to me. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed his stomach, wincing in pain, and made a dash for the bathroom. I heard his footsteps as he sprinted down the hall, and then a startlingly loud smash. I ran in after him and saw his body laying face down on the ground, completely straight, with his arms to the side and rigid like a board. There was blood dripping all down the bathtub when I realized he must have smashed his face. I sat him up and tried to get him cleaned up, his nose and mouth spewing blood all down his shirt. I tried to ask him what had just happened, but he was super disoriented and confused. Soon, I realized that he had a short-term memory loss, and every 30 seconds or so, he would forget everything. He could remember some basic things like who he was or what city we were in, but he couldn't remember who I was or where we worked or what we were doing prior to the incident. Even if I explained these details to him, he would just continuously forget them within 30 seconds to a minute, and I would have to re-explain it. After about 10 minutes of this, he promptly vomited all over his bed. I was completely freaking out at this point, so I called the paramedics and went with him to the hospital. I wrote "everything is going to be okay" on his hand with a marker, just in case he forgot why he was there or what was going on. I hung out with him at the hospital, and we drew in my sketchbook until the morning. Eventually, the nurses asked me to leave him be. The whole time I was with him, he was still experiencing memory loss, but a few days later I saw him and he seemed fully recovered. He's a really close friend to me now, and we often reference this experience as a moment when we became homies. There's still such an air of mystery around that night for me, and I can't explain how his wish to just forget it all was granted so immediately and violently. I have no idea why he jumped up and ran to the bathroom or how he slipped and hit his face on the tub. It was like his bad trip story just accumulated into this freakish moment of memory loss.